Good afternoon, everyone. Happy November, happy rainy fall day, and happy extra hour this morning. One of our sisters set her clock up, so she got a little bit more. We welcome to our associate candidates and our sponsors and sisters who are at Marion in Chicago. God has certainly given us a magnificent gift of color this fall, very much like what Sister Barbara and I witnessed as we drove to Park Hill, New York last week. I don't think it's any more magnificent than what we've had here in this area. This past Friday, we celebrated All Souls Day, remembering with love all of the deceased family members, friends, benefactors, and associates who have touched our lives with their goodness. And outside the chapel, if you are here during the month of November, there is a book of deceased where you're invited to write the names of the deceased in your family, and we will continue to remember them in prayer throughout this month. So you'll see the pictures of the sisters who died and the pictures of family members that died for our sisters also assembled there. So if you have time to go upstairs, please do add your family members. And already we look to the season of Thanksgiving and our family gatherings to celebrate together the many gifts that God has given us. And so as we gather today, we gather in thanksgiving. You have been given as you came in a copy of Lest We Forget, which is a part of our history, as Sister Mary Jean will explain to you today, but not all of it. So if anybody is a writer and would like to take up the job of finishing our history, you're welcome. Our speaker today is Sister Mary Jean Traeger, and she will be presenting the history of our Springfield Dominican community. Sister Mary Jean has been a Dominican sister of Springfield, Illinois since 1962. She holds a master's degree in theological studies from Aquinas Institute in St. Louis. She was one of the founding members of two leadership teams in Springfield, the Coalition on Housing Justice and Faith and the Coalition for the Common Good. As a member of the Springfield Dominicans, she has helped to guide her religious congregation in establishing and developing SSTART, the Springfield Dominican Anti-Racism Team. She's worked with Crossroads in that endeavor for the past 15 years and joined Crossroads in 2017 for another organizing effort, the Springfield Coalition on Dismantling Racism. Sister has recently joined Crossroads in 2017 for another organizing effort, the Springfield Coalition on Dismantling Racism. Sister Mary Jean identifies as a white woman who has a deep commitment to the dismantling of systemic racism in her own religious community, as well as in her regional work. We also welcome among us today one of the members of our SSTART committee, and also an associate, Leroy Jordan. So, Leroy, thank you for being with us today. I thought it would be fitting, since Sister Mary Jean is our speaker today, to use as our opening prayer the Dominican blessing that she wrote, that we use at many of our celebrations and liturgies. And we will be using this also at the liturgy for your commitment. And so it would be nice to learn it ahead of time and be able to respond. So if you would take the song sheet, Sister Mary Jean, if you'd come forward. And I'd like to ask that we read the words reflectively first so that we can think about what that message is to us, and then we'll sing it together a second time. May God, Creator, bless us. May God, Redeemer, heal us. May the Holy Spirit enlighten us and give us all we need. Eyes to see with, ears to hear with, hands to do the work of God, feet for walking, mouths for preaching, words of saving power, and the angel of peace to watch over us and lead us by our Lord's gift to the kingdom. Amen. And those who know the melody, if we could sing it a second time, and the third time I'll ask that we stand and extend hands over one another. So.
May God, Creator, bless us. May God, Redeemer, heal us. May the Holy Spirit enlighten us and give us all we need. Eyes to see with, ears to hear with, hands to do the work of God. Feet for walking, mouths for preaching, words of saving power, and the angel of peace to watch over us and lead us by our Lord's gift to the kingdom.
And once more, we can stand and pray out for one another. We can stand in hands.
May God, Creator, bless us. May God, Redeemer, heal us. May the Holy Spirit enlighten us and give us all we need. Eyes to see with, ears to hear with, hands to do the work of God. Feet for walking, mouths for preaching, words of saving power, and the angel of peace to watch over us and lead us by our Lord's gift to the kingdom. Amen. So, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here with you. I'm going to use this little stool if I can get organized because it'll be better for everybody if I'm a little bit more solid. I'm very happy to be invited to speak to you. I was surprised to be asked to do this particular topic because I had some other ones in mind, but God has God's ways, and it is what it is, so I hope you enjoy it. Sister Mary Joan mentioned the book, Lest We Forget, and I'm glad you have that because I make reference to it in some situations, and I don't expect you to look it up now, but it is a good resource for us. I just will make a couple of references to it. I want to start by saying that this is not your ordinary history talk, okay? I am not starting at the beginning and going to the end. I'm not telling every detail of what has happened in our congregation in the last 145 years. I couldn't do that even if I tried. What I'm doing instead is something that came to me and has come to the sisters that I live with as we've talked about the future of the congregation, the future of our own life together, and what God might be saying to us at this particular time in our history. So what I've chosen to do, I will tell the founding story, but I will tell it in a different way than maybe even some of our sisters have heard it before. And out of that founding story, I have chosen 4 other rather significant events in our history that I'll be talking about. And I think in the process of telling you the story of those 5 pieces, I think you'll learn a lot about our congregation. And what you don't learn, you can read in the book, but it's only the first 100 years. So you'll have to talk to each other and to sisters who know more of the history of the rest of it. But the point of it is that history is important to know. If we don't know our history, we can't go forward. But if we get stuck in the history, we can't go forward. So what we're doing is looking at the history with a view to the future. So keep that in mind as we go on. So first of all, let's see if I can make sure that I'm changing these pictures when I need to.
Are you ready for this PowerPoint to start?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right.
I know you have to do something, so that's fine. But we're going to, I just have a little bit of introduction. The story, the history of the Dominican Sisters of Springfield is one that is many-faceted, like those exquisitely artistic windows in our chapel. Almost everything we say about our lives, about our history, is woven of many threads. So these are the many woven threads that make up the history. Because we are a community at heart, who we are is shaped by the gospel. And we proclaim that gospel together. From the beginning, we were 6. Now the picture shows 7, and that's one of the things about our history. Nothing is ever exactly what we say. We've, through the beginning of our history, we've been between 6 and 8 because of circumstances that have changed and sisters who have had to return back to our founding home because of health issues or whatever. But anyway, from the beginning, we were 6. And we're now, sometimes we're 7, sometimes we're 8 in the history. The women who followed the call to go forth were following Jesus, who sent his disciples out together. Every community tells its foundation story in ways that are both personal and joined in a common commitment, both personal, individual. Tell both aspects of that story. Each person, each congregation, each community creates rather than is given a narrative. In other words, the idea is we make up how we tell the story. We decide. It's not just a monolithic thing and it's printed in a book and this is the way it always is. We give meaning to our experience. So our narrative, however we tell the story, makes sense of the realities around us. At least we try to make it make sense. Because that's what we're trying to do when we look at history. We're trying to make sense of what has happened and what continues to happen. We've had in our history, okay, now I have to own up to most of what I say today that is not exactly the facts in the book. I take responsibility for. Some of it may be different from the way other people would tell the story, but I'm the one telling the story, so I get to decide today. Okay. So, according to my experience, we've had at least 3 different narratives in our 145-year history. 3 different ways that we have tried to make sense out of part of our founding story that didn't make any sense at the time. And some of it still doesn't. So we have at least 3 ways of telling that, and that's some of what I'm going to start with. The facts are the same, but the meaning has changed over the years, and so we interpret those facts differently in different times. Some of the basics. The Dominican Sisters of Springfield, Illinois, were birthed by the Dominican Sisters of St. Catherine, Kentucky. They are our rock, and we are grounded on the pillars of prayer, study, common life, and ministry that we received in our heritage from them, but not only from them. We have long-term ancestors, even longer than the Dominican Sisters of St. Catherine. They include St. Dominic, whom you've studied already, I know, who was our 12th century founder and our mentor in preaching the gospel, one of our mentors, along with St. Catherine of Siena, who's in that picture in that statue next to him, and the multitude of Dominican women and men, many more than this. These are the ones that were saints at the time the mosaic was created, but we have many more. This is part of our heritage. So we start with our heritage. In 1870, then, the Sisters of St. Catherine, Kentucky, were just barely, I would say, trying to heal from the results, the effects of the most terrible war we had in our country, and that's the Civil War. Kentucky had remained neutral during that time, but that doesn't mean that they weren't affected. So they, like all people who survived that war, were trying to heal from the horror of what had happened in their country, in our country. That war took more victims than any other war we've been in, because all of the victims were ours, both the Confederates and the Union. So it was a terrible thing. So they were trying to heal from that, and they did it in the way they did as Dominican sisters. Renewal of their own vowed life, the way they taught the children and their parents how they could mend divisions in the community, how they could wound a nation that was still reeling, and in some ways we still are reeling from that horrible war. So that's where they were focused, not only that way, but also trying to figure out how to move forward after that. So there are some facts that are true and unchanging. There's a saying that says, all facts are true. Some of them really happened. These really happened. In 1873, the St. Catherine congregation was asked by God to break off a sprig from their southern root and send sisters to far-off Illinois to teach boys and girls in Jacksonville, Illinois. That's a fact. Fact number 2. Mother Regina, who was the major superior at the time, hastily gathered 7 sisters, hence the picture here, and prepared for ministry. 2 days later, this is fact number 3, they were on their way to Jacksonville. Mother Regina had consulted her council, her advisors, and the chaplain at St. Catherine's about whom to assign, And all of them understood that they were being sent to found a new foundation, to create a new congregation. Mother Regina, their council, the chaplain, they all knew that. Guess who didn't know? The sisters who were being sent. For a reason that will forever be mysterious to us, the sisters who were chosen did not know they were founding a new congregation. They thought they were sent on mission for a time to work with the children that they were supposed to teach, and eventually and periodically to return home, home being Kentucky. Through the years, our congregation has struggled with one very significant question. Why were they not told? And of course, heaven will be finding out the answer if we even care by that time. But we don't know. We don't know why they were told. So what do you do when you don't know? Well, you surmise, you make something up, you guess, you do whatever you can. And that's what we've tried to do over the years. Growing up in the community, my first experience of this story and the question, why weren't they told, is something like this. The time was short. This was the second group, by the way, that was called forth because the first group got assigned elsewhere. So one of the explanations is there wasn't enough time to tell them. Mother Regina, here's another part of that story. Mother Regina either didn't have the heart or didn't have the time to tell them. This narrative, this explanation is what I have heard when I first came to the community, and it was basically a defense of the Major Superior. Thank you very much. End of story. Later, in my experience in the community, and others, I think, would share this, we had a second way of telling the story. It was more realistic. We were more aware of the effect of human feelings. And the story was not only more realistic, it was less idealistic of our leaders. We decided in our talking together that the sisters, well, we didn't know exactly the answer, of course, but we had this sense of confusion and anger that must have been part of the story, which hadn't been told in the first narrative. We just made excuses for Mother Regina not telling us and went on for very good reasons because of the circumstances. But this story said there had to be some confusion and there had to be anger because that's real. And that's who people are, and that's what they have to deal with when they have a challenging experience. We'll never know if that's true or not, because by that time, all of the original parties were deceased. Just recently, our community had a community day, which we do periodically. And out of that community day, we raised up, those who were leading the program, raised up for us another way of looking at the story. I believe, and I think a lot of us do, it's a more freeing way to deal with some of the facts that were painful and truly painful, but aren't everything in the story. We know that in all three of the narratives, the sisters didn't know for 2 years that this was a foundation that they were forming. They just thought they were going on mission. So 2 years later, the pastor told them the truth, that they were to be an independent congregation. He also told them, at the same time practically, that here was a document from the bishop that you needed to sign in order to declare yourselves independent and a separate congregation. And he didn't say it this way, I don't think, but I imagine it was kind of like, and he's waiting for this. So they got the story of the truth that they were sent on mission permanently in an independent congregation, and they needed to sign the document and so that it could be sent back to the bishop. Now, needless to say, if they were going to do what they were asked to do, they had to set aside some of their personal feelings. And they had to make a decision, and they had to make it, they felt at least, that day. This was a decision. Sister Thomas Aquinas tells that part of the story in her book. And one of the things that she says is that this was a decision that could not be a collective group decision. Every person involved had to make her own decision. And she was free to make the decision to say, no, I don't think I can do that. And she would have been accepted back at St. Catherine's. Or yes, I'm going forward with this. So, but it had to be an individual decision. So the sisters made the decision that what they needed was a day of prayer to spend time with what they had just discovered so that they really could discern. And they did that. At the end of that time, they all made the decision to sign the document. And Sister Thomas Aquinas says eloquently in the book, each one had to search her own heart, weigh her own zeal, and measure her own vision. Search her own heart, weigh her own zeal, measure her own vision, and decide. That was a profound act of trust and faith and courage at a time where it was very difficult and they were still reeling from the news. But they did it. I believe that is, and I think some of us who've been thinking about this third narrative believe that is a transformative, the possibility of that being a transformative narrative for our future is very strong. It's hopeful while being realistic. It's honest, and it shows a freedom as well as a commitment. That day, those sisters signed the document. And they made a personal and eventually a communal commitment to act in a way that would determine their lives for the rest of their lives. We begin in this narrative, I think, to see a way that we can look at our future, not just our past, and our present. What have we learned by this narrative? What can we learn? Well, one of the things we can learn is, for us, it was never about blind obedience. Every sister had to decide for herself because it was her life that she had given to God in her vows, and it was her life that she was now giving more deeply. It's never about blind obedience. It has been, and I believe it is characteristic of our lives, about an intentional dedication to the vowed life in community where we share responsibility for the common good. Let me say that again. The way into the future and the way this narrative speaks is about an intentional dedication, rededication always, to to our vowed life in community with other sisters, sharing responsibility for the common good. The rest of the story you'll have to read the book for, because that's the founding story. And now we're going on to look at some of the other aspects that I think help us. I waited too long, and I guess it kicked off. Okay, the next story. Oh, there's an example. It wasn't the actual document. Okay. And there's what we heard. She had to search her own heart, weigh her own zeal, measure her own vision. Okay. The next part that we're going to talk about is has to do with one of our sponsored institutions. We're going to be talking about how in the book Lest We Forget, Sister Thomas Aquinas tells us the story, another narrative about how our sisters who were assigned for teaching children in schools, how they got into health care. And that's a very interesting story as well. It's another major superior who had a vision that even though we were teaching school, she was convinced, Mother Marie was convinced, that our sisters needed to broaden our ministry. This was some years later, of course. And that we would broaden our ministry by entering hospital work. None of the sisters had been in hospital work before, but she had this vision. And when she shared it with the community, apparently the community was enthusiastically supportive. However, it's important that they were enthusiastically supportive because Mother Marie died before her dream could be completed. So others needed to carry that vision forward. So it was good that people were supportive. She, however, had laid the groundwork for our involvement in hospital ministry by educating some of our sisters to become nurses. I know there's at least one here. You want to raise your hand? Two. Okay. So it wasn't Mother Marie who educated you, but someone else did. And lost track. So educating sisters to be nurses and accepting sisters into the community who already had nurses training. She laid that groundwork, others carried it forward. In our history, our congregation has at times been asked to administer a number of hospitals, 4 totally. Each one, as it happens, was located in the South and in the southern United States, and each one in some way has contributed to the development of our Dominican sisters, even if they never did nursing or never did health care. We've gained from every ministry that we've been in. We've been blessed by that. So what we're talking about now is St. Dominic's Jackson Memorial Hospital. This is where the sisters went at first, to Jackson Infirmary on April 26th of 1946. This is where the people of Jackson invited them to minister. It looks very quaint, but it was also rather dilapidated. We knew by that time that they had the skills and the education and the experience to serve in this kind of ministry. And they saw this invitation as an opportunity to present a comprehensive health care service in a state that was not known for having Catholic sisters, Mississippi. And nor was it known, particularly, that they had any kind of a commitment to justice. Both of those things are important to who they are, who we are, but that's a later point that we want to develop. So, in 1966, as it happened, the Dominican sisters in Jackson and everybody else in the country came face to face with the civil rights movement. Not in the way that this picture shows. For whatever reason, that wasn't our way of participating in something that has been very significant in our history. But they couldn't help but be involved in some way. And they were. And this, as you know, if you're old enough to remember the civil rights movement, that this was a transformative experience and a very disruptive and sometimes violent time in our history. The systemic racism that's in our history has been there from the beginning. It was in the South and the North of the United States from our very foundation and before. The Civil War broke those tensions open, and they threatened to destroy the nation. But even after the war, there were bitter divisions, and it made healing difficult. The country created some laws and passed those laws to establish justice, and I'm sure you know what some of them were. Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus the Board of Education are the ones that we usually think of. These were important decisions that the country made, at least the government made, to help with establishing justice in a space and a time, in a way that had not been addressed after the Civil War, during the Civil War, before the Civil War, and not even afterwards. However, in the South, including in Mississippi, these laws were most often ignored or sidestepped. They found ways around them. They resisted. And that's why we have things like the marches. Not just for the South, because it was in the North also, but it was very, very strongly present in the South. And St. Dominic's Hospital is in Jackson, Mississippi. As it turns out, right in the heart of some of the most challenging times. So, the sisters did take on a daunting task. They saw it as a daunting task, and they saw it as something that they couldn't sidestep. Doing what they could, and they always did that following the law as it moved along. Not anticipate, well, sometimes they did anticipate, but basically they used the law as a way of assuring that they could move forward in that way. So they did what they could, following the law, to provide equitable service for people of color and white people. That's the way I think they tried to approach that challenge. And they anticipated in some ways what they knew was coming down the line. You can read the newspaper, everybody can read the newspaper. So they moved their black patients in that infirmary that we saw before, were in a squalid basement of that building. And they were the only ones down there. And they were moved up to the first floor to more accommodating situation for them, to a more healthy situation, a more situation where they could be served better. But it still was separate but equal. That was the law, and that was what they thought they could do at the time. They moved the patients up there, and yet, in spite of those tensions, St. Dominic's and the people who supported St. Dominic's built a new hospital shortly before that time. But the new hospital in Jackson was opened in 1954, right at the peak of a lot of the crisis that was going on with the civil rights movement. They built that hospital, and it was opened in 1954, the same year that Brown versus the Board of Education declared that separate but equal was not inherently equal. So here we are, we've obeyed this law, a new law comes along, and the sisters have to discover what to do. And that was a challenge. It was separate but equal was replaced by a requirement that schools and other public places be integrated. The response in Mississippi was what was predictable in some ways, but not helpful at all. Mississippi responded by creating a white citizens council and a state sovereignty commission, both of which were created to circumvent and resist the desegregation laws. This is a picture of St. Dominic's, one of the older pictures of St. Dominic's. So that's how Mississippi and other states in the South responded to the new laws. They did everything they could to circumvent and resist. As that resistance to the new laws intensified, Jackson, the city of Jackson, became a hotbed, both for advocacy for the just laws and for resistance. As you can imagine, and as you can remember, it was difficult. It was very difficult. And so it was challenging, and there was turmoil. And there was blessing in it, because people were able, with that resistance, with the justice movement, were able to move things forward. But we know the stories of people who suffered greatly and physically because of their positions of trying to move that justice forward. This is just a little aside, but my brother, at the time of all of this, was in the military police in Atlanta. And his battalion was sent to Mississippi to protect James Meredith from the white mob that was trying to prevent him to enroll at the University of Mississippi. That's how close it was to our family. That's how close it was to the city of Jackson. And, as we all know, Medgar Evans was shot and killed in Jackson, Mississippi. This is where our hospital was. Looking back at history, it could be easy to say that the efforts that the sisters made were not enough. In effect, what they did was keeping with the law, sometimes trying to push the law a little further along, taking steps, but they tried consistently to move forward. A lot of people would say it wasn't enough. I suspect the sisters who were involved would say themselves it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough at the time, and history says it wasn't enough. Fortunately, more came along that helped, but this is the way they dealt with the reality. They judged themselves that they needed to move to continue to work toward desegregation in whatever way they could. One of the sisters, who was an administrator at the time, 5 months before the Civil Rights Act was passed, and we didn't know if it would be passed, but 5 months before that, Sister Rita Rose had created a plan for gradual desegregation of the hospital. And this is part I didn't know until I read a more recent book than that about it. That gradual desegregation plan started with the professional staff. That was a plan that she had created. In the meantime, and in the end, they had assistance from an unexpected source. The 1965 Medical Care Act. What came from that? Anybody know? Medicare and Medicaid. Federal funding for the first time was available to the states, but it required desegregation compliance. I think the sisters, and I think it said this way in the book I read, the sisters considered that a gift to them because it freed them to continue the movement towards desegregation, and they were able to move further along that. Most people chose to receive those services of Medicare and Medicaid rather than argue about what the color of skin of the persons in the bed and next to them. And that was a blessing. And it has enabled St. Dominic's to implement the process peacefully. Okay, I've given you 2 pieces now, and I'd like to give you a little bit of time to talk to each other at your tables, either about the founding story or about this story about St. Dominic's. What struck you? What impressed you? What surprised you? Just talk to each other about it, and I'll give you just about 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then we'll see if there's anything you want to say to everyone. So, take some time. Okay, I'm going to call you back. I know you haven't had much time, but I wanted to give another small piece, and then we'll take a break, and you can talk during the break too, and then when you come back, I'll ask you if there's anything you want to say to the whole group, so you will get more chance to talk. But this next part is not as long as the other parts, but it's a continuation in some ways. I mentioned that I was choosing 4 aspects of our life, and I did it that way because they're not only ministries. They're not only locations where we worked, but they're also decisions we have made. And this next one is the decision that we made around racism we have made. Now, I need to start by saying, as something that you already know, Mississippi is not the only place where racism existed. Nor, it might have been one of the more blatant examples at that time, but it's not the only place. Nor is that time the only time we've dealt with it and faced it, or tried to face it, or ignored it. Racism has been in our history since our foundation. And what people are discovering as they learn more about systemic racism is the effect that it has on us, especially people who are white, that makes us realize we have it with us and we don't even know it. You'll notice when Sister Mary Joan introduced me that she said, I don't introduce myself, but I think of myself as a white woman. And that might have sounded funny to you. Strange, I should say, not funny. And the reason I say that is because white people never have to think about being white. When was the last time you said, let me see now, as a white person, I think I'd better do X, Y, or Z. If you're white, you don't think that way. You don't have to think that way. We don't have to think that way. And so, what we need to do is to learn the realities and some of the truth that we were not taught. When we were children, we were not taught in school, we were not taught by adults around us, and people are beginning to see how endemic racism is to our culture and why it takes so much work to work against it. So I'm going to give just a short piece on that. So it's rooted in our history since our foundation. And our white tendency, for those of us who are white, is sometimes to exceptionalize and dismiss because it's too big and we can't do anything about it. Sometimes to minimize, to overlook. That's not a big deal. I don't use the N-word. How many times have we heard that? I'm not racist. So, white people have to learn the truth about white privilege, white superiority, white supremacy. And the fact that we haven't done that and that we have so many ways to avoid doing it is what makes eradicating racism so difficult. Most people, though not all, this is a statue that's in Alabama, in an area where they are trying to address racism in many ways. We who are white in this country sometimes have a difficulty seeing our privilege and supremacy. We carry it within us all the time simply by virtue of our color of skin. Everybody in that room is a white person. How do I know that? Because that's a picture of the Dominican Sisters of Springfield. And we're all white, except in Peru, where we have native Peruvian sisters who are part of our congregation who are not white. So, sometimes in our efforts to address racism, we focus exclusively on personal or individual racism. And that's where that I don't use the N-word, or I'm nice to people kind of thing, that comes up. But racism is more than personal and individual. But it has allowed our white privilege to overlook systems that where racism is deeply rooted and affects us all, people of color as well as white people. Our country has established certain principles, certain systems to assure that the benefits and the privilege come to some and are lacking to others, purely by virtue of skin color. We have a team that is approximately 50% people of color and 50% white people, mostly sisters and associates and others who are friends of ours that work with us. We invited people of color in relationship with us to join us on the journey because we can't battle systemic racism by ourselves as a total white congregation. No one can. Others who are committed to dismantling racism do so, join us, join other groups, because we know that racism doesn't just hurt people of color, it hurts us all, it harms us all. And it's more than individual and personal, it's systemic. So we work with other people to try to address the systems in government, in business, in finance, everywhere we turn, where situations have been established that give priority and preference to white people without our asking for it, without our even wanting it, without our being able to cut it out of our lives. It's just the way our country was established. And we're trying to find another way. And so in our team, these are some of the members of our team. We have, as I said, approximately 50% people of color, 50% white, including some of our associates and our sisters, and others who are interested in dismantling racism systemically. Our goal is to address systemic racism honestly, respectfully. To do it among members of a team, and to do what we can through analysis and training to empower others to take on the same commitment. We say, for the life of the world. Our hope is that anti-racism, resistance to racism can become ever more a way of life that keeps us moving into a new way of imagining a world where everyone is respected and honored with equal dignity, with equal opportunity to share the resources that God intends for all of us. As we say in Crossroads, which is the organization that we are part of that addresses systemic racism, it's about shared liberation and restored relationships with people and with the earth. That's what this work is about. Okay, I've been talking for quite a while. Talk at your tables, and let's take a break as part of that conversation. Keep the talking on the subject, but take your break, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes. What did you hear? What did you learn? What do you wonder about? Okay, are we ready to start up again? The problem when you just start dividing stuff up into sections is you have to keep track of what you've done and what you haven't done. Okay. While the civil rights movement was calling for justice, sometimes through violent resistance, and while the Jackson sisters were struggling with how to integrate St. Dominic's in ways that were equitable and peaceful, there was a very different reality beginning to germinate in Illinois. Those of you who are old enough to remember will remember Pope John the 23rd had been urging sisters, particularly in the United States, to send 10% of their members to Latin America to serve there. From what I can read, it appears that seemingly without hesitation, Mother Ida Marie Adams responded to the call because she wrote in a letter in December of 1961, in response to the plea of His Holiness Pope John the 23rd, that the American sisterhoods help to meet the needs of the Church in Latin America, the Dominican Sisters of the Congregation of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart, that's our official name, in Springfield, Illinois, are planning to send a group of 4 to 6 sisters to a mission in Latin America. This will be accomplished in 1964, or if possible, in 1963. Almost immediately, she wrote that response. And then she set about looking for people that she could send. Under Pope John, the church seemed young and vibrant and willing to serve generously where they were needed. It's not that it isn't still that way, but it's a different time. On March 16th, 1965, 4 sisters traveled to La Arroya in Peru, South America, to serve people there. 4 Dominican sisters from Springfield. They were sent on mission to serve there. In those days, that trip would have likely evoked from people a belief that they were bringing Christ to the poor in South America, in La Arroya and in Lima. That was a mentality, a mission mentality for some people, some Catholics at that time, that we would be bringing Christ to the people. If that simplistic attitude about mission was present, I don't know if it was or not, among our sisters then, it didn't take the sisters long to discover the truth. That Christ was already present in and with these gracious and generous people who reflected the face of Christ in their welcoming spirit and their willingness to teach the sisters other ways of being, other ways of working, of giving themselves in service. And I forgot. Change the pictures. That's our team, by the way, our anti-racism team. So there we are in the mountains, in the Andes Mountains. And those are the sisters, the first 4 sisters who were sent. The sisters, for their part, learned a great deal about what they did not know as they stumbled over an unfamiliar language and as they braved travel in the Andes, especially during the dangerous rainy season when one false step could send them tumbling over the mountainside. They were, no doubt, overwhelmed with what they had to learn. But they were happy, trusting that they were where God had called them to be. So much did that joy shine forth that eventually young sisters, young women, I should say, asked to join them in their life as Dominican sisters. These are our first 4 entries and their formation director. The sisters were touched by the requests that these women made to be able to join them, and they sent that word back to Springfield, to our leadership, and to the community of sisters who would help them grapple with all of the realities that eventually led to a decision. On March 6, 1986, a new era began in the history of the Springfield Dominican community. 4 young Peruvian women entered the newly prepared formation house in a part of Lima called San Borja, and they became, and we became, a multicultural, international congregation. Meanwhile, there was danger brewing in the upper Andean city of Ayacucho. A young man named Carlos Abimael Guzman was biding his time, surrounding himself with other malcontents who would follow him into a Marxist movement that he would eventually call Sendero Luminoso, shining path. In the early 80s, Guzman agitated students to violence, prompting the military to react with repressive measures against their own people. The chaos this created pitted family members against one another and led to the killing of thousands of innocent people throughout the upper Andes. Terrorism reigned in an undeclared war which devastated the country for 20 years. In all of this terror, our sisters discerned, our sisters who were already there from the States, discerned to remain present with the people. And the sisters we accepted, of course. They joined groups of missionary teams who visited the people caught in the middle of the violence. They put a face on the people largely ignored by the rest of the world, who watched from a distance the violence that tore the country apart. Religious were not spared from the fray during this time of terror. Gratefully, none of our sisters was killed, but it would be wrong to say that they were not harmed. They faced the prospects of dying every day when they walked out the front door. The sisters buried some of their closest friends who were murdered by senderos or by the military. Some of their closest friends who were sisters. These same sisters braved this terrible time and have likely carried the scars of war long after the fighting ended and the process for truth and reconciliation was concluded. They did have a process of truth and reconciliation in Peru. That didn't wipe away all the scars. Still, in God's mercy, none of these horrors of the times has stopped the movement of the Spirit. This is another part of our history. I'd like to invite you to a couple of more minutes of silence and then to see if there's anything you want to say about anything you've heard so far, including this section. Questions or comments? When we tell our history, some of it's hard to tell. And this is the fruit of some of it. These are our Peruvian sisters. Yes.
Pat, I was just struck by the timing when you talked about, the racism in Mississippi, and that was the time when we moved down there.
Exactly.
And then we were able to embrace it, do what we could with it. And then, and even being in Peru, I mean, they were there during that Sendero Luminoso period, which was terrible.
Right.
And but they stayed too to be with the people. And racism. I mean, these people here, Peruvians, they experienced racism. Mila talked about.
That's okay, just pick up where you're.
They experience racism even in their own country. I mean,
Yes.
It's just such, it's almost inbred in us, I think, and like we say, we don't know when we are racist. And sometimes we think we're not, when we are. I mean, we can't recognize it because coming from my white mentality, I didn't experience any of these racist situations, so I try to understand, but it is just another world, really. But it's great to think about Mississippi and being there and having the opportunity to embrace it, experience it, being in Peru, another opportunity to be with people of color, and we don't know where we're going next. But.
Right. And I remember as Prioress General, I visited in Peru during some of this time when Sendero was active. And I remember being at a mass that we were going to with other sisters and priests and lay people who were gathering to pray at a time when one of the tools that they used for the terror was to turn off electricity. And so you were in the dark a lot. And we were in the dark celebrating Mass. And I remember thinking, anybody could come in at any time. And it was the most dramatically I had ever experienced that kind of experience. And this is what the sisters lived with for, what did I say, 20 years? Mm-hmm. Was it that long? Yeah. I think so. Okay. Sister Santina.
There was a story I heard about systemic racism in South America. In Dominican tradition, the local prioress is selected from among the local sisters. And some of our North American sisters were among the South American, but a South American sister was elected prioress. And this North American sister told me the story of when she and her local prioress, a South American sister, were shopping. And the South American sister asked the worker for something, or to pay the bill, or some interaction. And he looked at her, but he addressed his answer to the North American sister. He did not address the South American. And the North American sister said, "You wish to talk with sister," pointing out that she is the one to speak to. And he consistently spoke to the North American. Yes. And even some of our brilliant South American sisters who are professors have suffered a racism, maybe on two counts, because they're women of color and because they're women. Right. And who could be a theologian with that credential?
If you were here for Mass last night and you heard Sister Mila preach and speak of her own experience, sexism and racism, as she teaches in a seminary in Chicago. And she is taught in Jerusalem and other places besides that. So, yes. Okay. Anything else you want to ask or say about anything you've heard so far? Yes.
You said that You said that she experienced the sexism and racism in the seminary also?
Yes. And she's teaching in the seminary.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
She's
That's
teaching in the seminary
to me.
and is experiencing racism from some of her students.
In fact, she's on her way to Jerusalem today.
Okay? So, that's the heavy piece. And it's part of our history. And it's also blessing when you look at the fruit that God has provided. So I want to honor that as we go forward. So, where do we go from here? Well, there's one more piece that I want to share before we talk about future. But keep listening to what you're hearing, not just as past history, but how is all of this integrated into what you are considering? Some of you have already are associates or members of the congregation, but some of you are in the process of becoming associates. So what do you hear in the stories that can also help us look to the future and what we are called to be and to do? If you choose to associate yourself with the Dominican Sisters of Springfield. So this final piece of the narrative addresses an area of study and exploration that has been part of our most recent history. Even though we haven't been with it as long as other aspects of our life, I see it as significant for creating the future we want to be. Once again, God has ways of plunging us into places we might never have imagined going, and then asking us to live out of what we discover there. That's the way God works a lot. You've probably noticed that in your own life. In 1996, one of our sisters, Sister Sharon Zayak, concluded her time in a challenging ministry. And at the end of that time, she asked for and received permission for a sabbatical, which she did by going to Amityville, New York, for a program called Coming Home to the Whole, W-H-O-L-E. The program invited her to explore the evolving universe story and the integrity of creation. Sharon was totally captivated with what she learned. So much so that she wanted and dreamed of continuing to tell that story to as many people as possible. And she's been doing that ever since in her ministry. So what is this universe story? And why do so many scientists and so many theologians believe it's so significant? And that's remarkable, that scientists and theologians are working together on this endeavor to understand our universe. The universe story tells us about our 13.8 billion year history. 13.8 billion years. We can't even fathom that. But it's part of who we are. It's part of our life. It's part of what God has placed among us. It began with some kind of a singular event, which some have named the Big Bang, but which no one has yet been able to describe or fully explain. Still, the universe story opens up literally a whole new way of imagining the amazing creation we call home. It proposes that the whole of life, the whole of existence, is interconnected in the deepest, most profound way. We celebrate our own uniqueness, and at the same time we realize that we are not separate from each other or from anything else in the universe. We are one. Also, our universe is not a static thing, but it is continually expanding. That's what scientists tell us. It's continually expanding in an evolutionary movement. We're continually becoming, growing into deep communion, into more profound beauty, all of which reflects, incarnates, and enfleshes our Creator. If we can say that about our universe, how can we imagine our Creator? The universe is future-oriented, ever evolving, always reaching for greater meaning. The universe story moves beyond a narrow way of thinking about reality. It's inclusive, cosmic understanding we're looking for. Ultimately, this reality has the potential to draw us all together in unity, recognizing that we're all related and enfleshed and neighbors to one another. Not just living things, but all things. We move forward by collaborating with one another, not competing over scarce resources as we so often think we have to do in this society, but sharing in the great abundance of Earth's gifts. Imagine what such learning can mean for a world that seems intent on battling for limited resources, despising those who are different from ourselves, and continually competing for power over others. Imagine a different universe, because that's the universe we have, is not all of that competition, but that oneness. Just imagine how opening our minds and our hearts and our world to a spacious way of being could create harmony and blessing among us. That's what we've been given. And most of us don't even know it. And this is not a fairy tale. This is the discovery of scientists and theologians working together to open up the whole universe for discovery and celebration. Talk about a future full of hope. Imagine praying with such fullness of grace in mind. What kind of future is, in fact, available to every single being? comments, questions? Silence is its own commentary. I said at the beginning that I'd be sharing a new way of telling the story of our history. And part of our history is in that universe that hasn't even unfolded for us yet. There are only 4 major pieces that I've presented that I name as having potential to move us forward into the future that God has designed for us. That doesn't mean they're the only 4, of course, because the universe is ever expanding, ever giving. These are not the only pieces of the story, even for our history. Yet these pieces, as well as all the others, belong to all of us. If we don't own them, and as you consider becoming associates to the congregation, with the congregation, you need to think about what that means for you to be part of the story that we've told and the future that we look towards. If we don't own them, we need to work on owning them. And work doesn't mean roll up your sleeves and get out the buckets of water. It means working in a prayerful and understanding way, and an openness to understanding more than we do. Because if the universe is continually unfolding, so is mystery, always. These are part of what we carry forward as we look at our history and our future. As Dominican sisters, as associates with us, as the universe. There are many other pieces that are just as significant, and perhaps even more so, that we haven't even touched on. But I want to leave you with one more kind of narrative. That itself, it's a famous picture, of course, but you could look at it forever and into it. You'll recognize this as one of the windows in our chapel. The artistry of the chapel windows is made up of multicolored glass put together with concrete between the spaces. That's an artist's amazing creation that has come from the mind of God. These are part of what we carry forward. These are part of the story that we tell and the story that we unfold and we allow to continually unfold. Many other pieces are just as significant and perhaps more so. I want to leave you with one more narrative then. The artistry of the chapel windows, every window is magnificent in color and design. Think about the color as the work of God, the image of the color in those windows as the work of God. Between the panes of glass are those patches of concrete that are fitted into the design. They are absolutely necessary, even though they're not as brilliant as the glass. The concrete represents the contribution of every single person, every single sister, every single associate, every single person with whom we as a congregation and others are associated. Everyone who has ever been a member of this congregation, think about that concrete that's holding that gift of God together for us, in us, with us. Everyone who has ever been a member of this congregation of Dominican Sisters of Springfield or associated in any way. And it's not that we have something that others do not have. This is our story, and you have your other stories to tell. But every single ministry, every single gift, every single service, every presence of people who have contributed in any way for the life of the world. Imagine it in these pieces of glass held together by concrete. Use that image of concrete as an image of all of us. While we are unique and indispensable, we all contribute in God's eyes as we can, as long as we can, for the life of the world. No one is more, no one is less. All are gift. Gift from God through us to others, to those who are near, and into the ever-expanding universe. For each and every one, we give thanks.